read her bio. I'm going to read Stacy's about. All right, Stacy, it's not as long as the previous one, so you guys are going to be. Stacy Diebel Reynolds has an extensive background working in family engagement, substance abuse prevention, and positive youth development programs over the last 19 years. She has worked in various settings, including a psychiatric hospital, after-school programs, and school districts in Sacramento and Southern California. She currently serves as the director of the Orange County Department of Education Student Achievement and Wellness Unit in the Educational Services. Ms. Reynolds holds a master's degree in public administration from California State University, Long Beach, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Irvine. She is a passionate advocate for education that supports the whole child and enthusiastically embraces opportunities to collaborate around this work. Stacy. She's a friend of the center. I feel like I'm way overselling her, so here you go.
You are way overselling me. I am actually just facilitating this session. So that was a whole wonderful introduction, and I'm going to be asking the questions on the Slido to two of my colleagues. So with that, I'm not giving a presentation, but I am introducing my colleagues who will be coming on up here. So if Pamela Kahn and Stephanie Lasco can start walking up. As they're walking up, I'll tell you that I do serve as the Director of Student Achievement and Wellness at the Orange County Department of Ed. I've spoken at this conference before. I'm so proud and honored to partner with Sandy in this work and for this conference. I'd like to acknowledge real quickly Sherry Newman. Where's Sherry? Sitting back here. She's raising her hand. From our office, she has been the right-hand woman for me with this conference, working closely with Sandy's right-hand woman, Jennifer Milton. So, quick acknowledgement. Pamela Kahn. Pam and Stephanie work at the Orange County Department of Ed. Pam is our coordinator of health and wellness in Orange County at the Department of Ed. She works with all of our 28 school districts' head nurses, and they in turn work with their nurses at their school sites. So, in addition, she acts as an advisory position regarding health programs and health care to all of our county's districts, and then she works closely with community agencies. She's done a lot this last week or so, especially around coronavirus, helping our communications team to get information out to schools. I'm not going to read through the whole bio, if that's okay, or I could, but she also serves as president of the California School Nurses Organization, CSNO. She has been published in Nursing World Magazine, the Journal of School Nursing, Congenital Cardiology Today, and has contributed chapters to the second edition of School Nursing, a comprehensive text, and to the recently published Legal Resources for School Health Services. There's a lot more you can read about Pam, so I'll let her talk, and then I'll introduce Stephanie. Is that okay? Pam and Stephanie also, just personal note, they are two of the most intelligent and beautiful inside and out people I get to work with. So we'll go ahead and start with Pam.
Thank you, Stacy. Very kind words. Good afternoon. Yeah, you can imagine what life has been like lately with the onset of the coronavirus, right? And I tell you, the worst part of this whole thing is fighting down the rumors and the fears and getting people to concentrate on what's important, which really is always, I got to get on my soapbox right now, practice personal hygiene, because of course the flu is a far more higher threat right now than coronavirus. I'm not telling you to ignore coronavirus, but pay attention to the elephant in the room, which is flu. So if you take care of yourself for flu, you will also take care of yourself for coronavirus. That's a different topic, but I had to get that in because, a matter of principle. Okay, so what we're going to do today is give you a little teaser of what we're going to elaborate more on tomorrow in our individual sessions. We're going to talk about trauma in kids, which obviously the presentation that just occurred prior to us was a fabulous example, and that's a bad word to put to that, but a very good example of some of the trauma that our kids survive and have to live through. There are many kinds. Sexual abuse is certainly one of them. So I'm going to do sort of an ACEs light presentation right now, and if it's a topic that you're interested in learning more, I'm just going to brush through some points, but tomorrow in my presentation I will go into great depth on some of the science behind this, what we see, and how to help children who are suffering with trauma, and adults. So Stephanie and I are talking about building strong children. And how many of you have heard of ACEs? Oh, I love this. I've been, on this soapbox probably for 10 years or so, and people used to not know. I would be in a room of nurses or teachers, and one or two would raise their hand. So the word is spreading, which is fabulous, because it is such an elementary concept, and when you learn about it, and when you know what it's all about, in your head you're going to say, of course this makes sense. But you just never thought it through and laid it out. This ACEs study and the information about ACEs kind of scaffolds what you intuitively know. So I'm very excited to share this with you, and hopefully you will learn something. And as I say, if you want to go a little more in depth, come see us tomorrow. So can we go back to, do I have control of the slides? Yeah, okay. So adverse childhood experiences, which we also call ACEs, are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today, coronavirus included. And this is why the past president of the AAP, and we're going to tell you why. What are ACEs? Actually, adverse childhood events, but we call it, or experiences, but we are going to shorten it to ACEs from here on in. ACEs are serious childhood traumas, and there's a whole definition of what trauma is and trauma isn't, and that varies from person to person. But it's traumas that result in toxic stress, which is chronic ongoing stress. There are different kinds of stress. We have eustress, we have tolerable stress, and then we have toxic or chronic stress. And those happen in the context of daily life, sometimes with supporting relationships. Toxic stress, usually there are no supporting or buffering relationships. So toxic stress is chronic, ongoing trauma that can actually harm a child's physiological development of their brain when they're young. When that brain is damaged, those children cannot learn in a healthy way. They don't know how to play in a healthy manner. They get long-term health problems, and this is what really the crux of ACEs is. And of course it results in emotional and behavioral issues, which is probably no surprise. Those of you who have known trauma in your life or worked with children who have had trauma in your life, this is a truth that you obviously are aware of. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems. Trauma that a child experiences in their first early years, or even in their youth all the way up to their teen years, has a profound effect on health in later years, which you wouldn't necessarily imagine. But it's a total straight line how this happens. Also linked to mental illness, emotional behavioral issues as an adult as well as a child, and substance misuse and other risky behaviors in our youth and young adults and older adults. So what is the ACEs study? This was a really groundbreaking study. Do I have it? I think it began in 1994, quite a long time ago. And it finally put together that childhood trauma leads to the adult onset of chronic diseases, which again means long-term, ongoing, depression, other mental illnesses, violence, being a victim of violence, as well as causing a lot of havoc in your life in way of financial and social issues. Kaiser in San Diego began this study, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's an ongoing collaboration between CDC and Kaiser. Kaiser studied about 17,000 of their members beginning in 1994. The study went on for a few years. However, there are varieties of this study that have been ongoing since, and those of you who are familiar with the sciences know that the validity of an experiment or project is only shown when it can be duplicated, right? This has been duplicated over and over again, this study. So Dr. Vincent Folletti from Kaiser had started a weight loss clinic. I'll go a little bit into this because it's interesting how it started. And it was for morbidly obese people, people who were 100 pounds and more overweight. People, if they only wanted to lose 20 or 30, could join, but he was targeting profoundly overweight people, obese people. Program was going well, people were losing weight, and everything was hunky-dory, and all of a sudden he noticed that there was a fairly substantial percentage of people dropping out of the study. Even though they were losing weight, they were accomplishing the goal they came to achieve, they were dropping out. He didn't understand why. So he started to talk to them about their whole life. He had a questionnaire, and he would ask them questions about their early life, current lifestyle, etc., to try and find out what was the problem. He describes interviewing one woman, and obviously this was a weight clinic, so they were talking a lot about weight, and he had asked her the question, how old were you when you had your first sexual experience? That's part of the whole battery of questions. She answered him 40 pounds. And he said, no, that's not what I asked. How old were you? And she says, I was 4. She had confused the weight because they were talking about weight. But she was 40 pounds and she was 4 years old when she'd had her first sexual experience. He went on to sort of, that woke him up, and he started to notice that all of the people that were dropping out had experienced some kind of trauma or adverse childhood event in their life. For example, there was a man who had been quite overweight, lost his weight, dropped out, put it back on. He said, I was bullied when I was younger. When I lost the weight, I didn't have that protection anymore. He felt safer being heavy. Women with, who've been sexually abused oftentimes make themselves unattractive. So it's a sequelae, that's a sort of a medical term, it's what happens afterwards, it's a sequelae of childhood trauma that these people were keeping the weight on. It was their way of coping with their trauma. And there's all kinds of mannerisms of coping, which we're going to talk about at depth tomorrow. In the study, when he interviewed the people from Kaiser, 2/3 of the study participants reported at least one adverse childhood event, and we'll talk about what they are, such as abuse or neglect, and most of them reported more than one. What they found was if a person answered yes to one question, there's an 80% chance they would say yes to another question. There's a strong dose relationship between the number of ACEs that people reported or said yes to and poor health outcomes later in life. If you want to look up the questionnaire, you can. Don't worry about that link. All you have to do is Google ACEs questionnaire and it will pop up. It's a series of about 18 questions. I think it is exactly 18. Some of them are as simple as, did you ever lose a parent to separation or divorce? That's not uncommon, is it? That's considered an adverse childhood event. One of the questions is, did you ever live with someone who had suffered from mental illness? That doesn't mean schizophrenia or, homeless on the street not being able to take care of yourself. That includes anxiety and depression, which is hugely prevalent in our society, right? Questions such as, was there ever times where there was not enough to eat in the house, or you didn't have clean clothes? Look at nearly half of our kids in California live in what we call poverty. So these are not outlandish questions, but these are all considered adverse childhood experiences. And the more a child has, the more profoundly they are affected physiologically, emotionally. There are 3 types of ACEs. We call it abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The questions address these areas. Abuse can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect can be emotional or physical. And household dysfunction, they looked at things like mental illness, as I described, an incarcerated relative. And how many people in our community have an incarcerated relative? Quite a few of our children do, unfortunately. Whether the mother was treated violently, was there substance abuse, alcohol and or drug use in the family, and divorce, as I mentioned. These are some of the questions. Okay, where am I going? There. So what happens when a child experiences ACEs? I alluded to a little bit of it earlier, but we'll talk about this. Toxic stress is caused by frequent or prolonged adversity, the ACEs, and it's the extreme, frequent, or extended activation of the body's stress response. We all know when we feel stress, we feel it physically, right? Your heart beats, your stomach might get upset, you sweat, you're breathless, etc. There are physical consequences, and your hormones are activating those physical responses. Well, imagine if that was always going on with you. It depletes your system. It wreaks havoc on your system, your immunity, your development and your growth and your healing, etc. And toxic stress, as I mentioned earlier, happens without the support, the buffering presence, they call it, of a supportive adult. A lot of our kids don't have anywhere to turn, and that makes the difference between toxic stress and tolerable stress. Toxic stress particularly harmful for children whose brains are just developing. There's the amygdala and the hippocampus develop very early on in the brain, and they have to do with short-term memory, discerning threats, appropriate emotional responses, etc. Those grow and develop early and are pretty well done growing and developing early, and they are particularly affected by stress hormones. So in other words, their growth and development are compromised. They do not work like healthy adults do. Mental health disorders, alcohol and substance abuse, and physical issues are things that we see who kids who have suffered trauma, which I've already talked about. This is an interesting pyramid, and it sort of takes you through the line. This is the ACEs pyramid. So it starts at the bottom where you're conceived, conception, and born, and up to death. So when you're born, say you suffer adverse childhood experiences, one of the 18 and or more. Those are touchstones, but there are more than those 18 questions. When you have adverse childhood experiences, you suffer disrupted neurodevelopment, like I just mentioned, and I go more into that tomorrow. When you suffer disrupted neurodevelopment, you are unable to function normally, socially, emotionally, and cognitively. Those functions are impaired. You don't have the amount of gray matter that a person with no trauma has. Your organs in your brain, the amygdala and hippocampus and others are compromised. You simply cannot function what we call in a normal manner. When that happens, you're likely to adopt risky health behaviors, right? My favorite, and I'm going to confess this to you, and it's Friday and I'm happy about that, because on Friday night I get to have a martini. That's my stress reliever. But we all have our stress relievers. You may eat chocolate cake. Mine is my martini. You may sit and watch TV all day tomorrow and not move because that's what you like to do. But we all have our supporting behaviors. We, as healthy people, can keep them in line and appropriate. But, we know people who can't. Alcoholics, smokers heavily, girls who look for love in all the wrong places because that's how they define love when they've been sexually abused, etc. We adopt high health risk behaviors, poor coping strategies when we're not functioning well. When we adopt those health risk behaviors, we are likely to develop disease. How about cirrhosis of the liver? Disability, if you're depressed so much that you can't function and go to work. Or social problems. Alcoholics don't have the best marriages, right? People who can't control their sexual appetites don't have the best relationships. People who can't trust don't establish good relationships. And when we have disease, disability, and social problems, we are quite likely to have an early death. So this is the direct line of what ACEs does to people's lives. So ACEs, we know it differs by ethnicity. These were two different studies that were done. In 2011 and 12 is the blue, and 2016 was done in the red. Non-Hispanic whites went from 11 to 10% with 3 or more, which is pretty pronounced trauma in your life. Non-Hispanic blacks had 15 and we're up to 17 in 2016. Hispanics stayed level at 11 in their reporting. And non-Hispanic others went from 13 to 11. This was from the National Survey of Children's Health data. So while they varied slightly, that's pretty consistent through the years. Some went up, some went down. We also know that ACEs varies by income. Poverty level and below, 14% of our kids have 3 or more, down to 13% in a later study. 100 to 200% of poverty level, 12 down to 10, and above 200% of poverty level, 6 to 5. So the more poverty level you live in, the higher your risk for ACEs, and that's due to malnutrition, chaos, stress, instability, etc. All the things that can accompany poverty. One good thing we're going to talk about is the Assembly Bill 340. We have a new Surgeon General in California for the first time. Anybody knew about that? Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, and one of her primary work goals has been in the area of ACEs and early childhood trauma and how to address that. So there's a big push in California right now. She's been in effect, she's been the Surgeon General since February 19th, so about a year. In July 1st, 2019, Assembly Bill 340 took effect, and it requires our kids who are enrolled in Medi-Cal insurance that the physicians assess them for early childhood trauma. It's required. They also are assessing some adults, but they must address this in children periodically throughout their childhood. Kaiser already does a depression screening on all 11 and 12-year-olds. I don't know if you know that. So we've got some companies coming up and figuring this out, health insurance companies. But Medi-Cal's requiring it now. And what their goal is to assure that children who are victims of trauma, we find them, we catch them, we intervene early. Family resources, children supportive resources, etc. Can we improve the outcomes? We may not be clinicians, we may not be physicians, we may not be in a lot of positions to help with therapy, or you may, but we all can make some difference in a child's life and in our own lives and in the lives of those we love. How do we do that? We reduce the dosing of diversity. That's far simpler said than done. But that's why we're here, trying to learn about how it happens, what we can do to ameliorate it, how we help families. We enhance the systems of buffering caregiving. We make sure children are connected. We work very hard in the educational system to make sure that children feel connected at school. School climate is very critical because we know that that can sometimes make a difference in a child's life if they can connect with one adult. We educate and we train our staff in the schools in trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive practices, which is what we're doing all today with you. We try to provide safe and stable environments. We try and help our teachers learn how to create continuity, stability, predictability with these kids. Exercise. You know, it really has shown that regular exercise works as well in reducing depression as a mild antidepressant. So get out and exercise. It reduces your stress. Even if you come home and you say, oh, I'm so tired. Get up and walk around the block and you're going to come home with twice as much energy as you left with. I guarantee you, just try it. Mindfulness. Think about what you're doing. Kids who have suffered from trauma and adults are constantly under flight or fight. They can't regulate themselves. Mindfulness. Think about what's happening. Be aware of what's happening. Am I really in danger now? And that can help reduce the hormones, it's stress hormones. Good nutrition never hurts. They have found that ADHD has some benefit by certain vitamins. We can reduce the effects of that. And sleep, the most critical factor. Do you know you don't heal, your immune system isn't functioning well, all of that unless you sleep. That's important for all of us, and kids need a lot of sleep. So these are just some things we can do right now. And I want you to remember this, that if you can help a child, we don't have to spend years repairing an adult, right? So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie now.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce Stephanie. Thank you so much, Pam. Stephanie Losko is the Crisis Response Network Program Specialist for the Orange County Department of Ed. In this role, she provides certification training to school and community-based personnel in crisis intervention and coordinates response services to support Orange County school communities when a critical incident occurs. She's passionate about serving students, families, and school personnel in this capacity and strives to bring a trauma-informed approach to all that she does. She is an MSW and Pupil Personnel Services credential from Cal State University, Long Beach. Please help me welcome Stephanie.
I can hold it, yeah. Thank you, Stacy. Hello, everybody. So this portion of the, and like Pam said, I'm going to be doing thank you. This is just a snippet for what we'll be diving into tomorrow if you come to my workshop. But this is now responding to ACEs and other traumatic events. And as mentioned by our esteemed judges earlier, most of the youth they're seeing come through Grace Court are either experiencing or have experienced a traumatic event. And so that is why it is so important, right? That's one of the reasons why it's so important that we really know how to identify when a student is experiencing trauma and then how to effectively respond to that, right? We can all respond to it, but are we doing it in a way that's going to best meet their needs and put them back on a path where they can thrive? And so before I jump in, I did want to give a brief overview and set some context to what we do at the Orange County Department of Education in our Crisis Response Network. And so we serve all 28 school districts across the county. We also serve public and private charters. We serve private and charter schools when there's a critical incident. So we have a collaboration with the Orange County Sheriff's Coroner Division. And so we receive death notifications for all minors in the county. And that comes through our office. We notify the district, right? And then we offer our support. We also have a strong collaboration with the Trauma Intervention Program. And so that's a community-based service that goes out to different incidents across the county to inform us when there has been a car accident, maybe a parent suicide, right? These are things that our districts really need to know about and in a timely fashion so that we can best meet the needs of the students who are impacted by that traumatic event, right? I think that's our main focus here in this program. And then we have a network of trained responders, so we can respond alongside the district if they need us to. A lot of districts have really robust crisis response teams now, but we also help consult. We provide resources, whatever they need, we're here to support. And I have to say, our collaboration with our districts is so important. You know, they are truly the experts, and then we're here for supplemental support as they need it. We are very lucky that we're funded through the Orange County Health Care Agency, so we have Prop 63 dollars, Mental Health Services Act dollars, and so we can provide the service free of cost, which is hard to come by anymore, so that's really fantastic as well. So some of the incidents that you see up here, these are some different things that we would consider traumatic, right? So they don't necessarily all fall into the ACEs category, but they are absolutely going to be traumatic events in our students' lives. And so we see things, and we have seen most of these things in the Crisis Response Network. So things like student death or medical concerns, terminal illness. Of course, if there is a staff or parent death or terminal illness, that's something that we need to jump on, especially coaches, right? We know how important coaches are in our young people's lives. Homicides, automobile accidents, same thing with aircraft accidents. Fires, gang-related incidents, school shootings, and more often now too, we're trying to shift and say, you know, even if there's not a shooting, but if there's a lockdown, could that potentially be traumatic for our students? Especially considering how publicized and how much we see on the news when things like Parkland or the Saga shooting happens, right? And then we go on lockdown, and is that fear-provoking? Absolutely. And so are we responding appropriately to our students after something like that happens? Because I'm sure they have questions. If we're fearful of this as adults, certainly students are fearful of this as well. And so when we look at an incident, no matter what it is, and it's in the, you know, they say beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think trauma's in the heart of the beholder, right? It depends on what has happened to you, of whether or not you're going to respond and how you're going to respond when something happens. And so I think there's a lot of things that we have to consider when we are dealing with a traumatic incident. And so these are some of those, there we go. So these are some of those things we have to consider when we're going out and we're responding, right? So things like social context, and Pam touched on this. So things like socioeconomic status, things like social support, these are really important things to consider. Biological genetic makeup, developmental level and age, past exposure to trauma, loss or fear of a loved one, your ACE score, that's huge, and then proximity to the traumatic event. And when I say proximity to the traumatic event, when we're coordinating a response, we try to think about it as a drop of water falling into a pond. And I want you to visualize this. So when that drop of water hits, that's the initial impact site, right? And so of course the people within that first ring are going to be really, right, because it ripples out. The people within that first ring are the people who were closest to the person who died, or the people who witnessed that traumatic event, right? And of course they're going to be very severely impacted. Now we have to though look at that second and third ring, because we don't know what every student's trauma history looks like. We don't know what each student has recently experienced. I hate to say it, but we've been out on different responses where we've been responding to a death by suicide of a student. And we have students who come to the office because, right, we've made it public to the school community that they can come there and get support if they need it. And this student didn't even know the student who died by suicide, but they've been having suicidal ideation, right? And so now we have to jump into assess mode and all of that, but had we not made that service available to those outer rings that could potentially be affected, could that student have been missed? And so it's more than just that initial drop in the bucket that we have to be worried about. When something happens, we have to make those services very widely known so that students, because it's kind of that opportunity, right? And I don't know if anybody's a Brene Brown fan in here. All right, me too. Absolutely. But she was on Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, and this stuck with me, and it continues to. But she was on there, and she was talking about John Gottman's work and sliding door moments. Has anybody seen the movie Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow? me see like a couple hands. It was a good moment. It was okay. Okay, let's see some more. So I'll give away the punchline, and I apologize for the spoiler, but she is running to get on this train, and in one clip she gets on the train, and in the other clip she doesn't, and that leads to very radically different endings in her life. And so what we're trying to do here, right, when we think about ACEs, when we think about critical incidents, when we think about trauma in our students' lives, the sooner we can intervene, the more dramatically I think we can affect the ending of their lives. And so I always think about that, right? It's that sliding door moment. And so when we are given the opportunity to intervene, and obviously as soon as possible, we have to. But we have to know how to, right? That's so important too. So I will say these are some things that we're going to see in our students who have experienced trauma. These are going to be some things we see, those initial distress responses in our students after there's been a critical incident. So things like development of new fears, separation anxiety, especially in our very young children, right? And regression as well. Sleep disturbances, feeling sad or upset, loss of interest in normal activities, reduced concentration, decline in schoolwork, anger, irritability, somatic complaints. Right? So there's no medical cause, but there's headaches, there's stomach aches, things like this. And obviously this is going to vary child to child, depending on, again, all those considerations we spoke about. But we need to know how to support. And I kind of want to break this down. So we need to educate our youth on what to expect and normalize reactions. I think a lot of times we're scared to tell students this is what you might expect because we're going to put something in their head. But if we don't let them know what they might expect, and especially if this is their first instance in experiencing something really critical or traumatic, they're going to label themselves as crazy. They're going to think, why am I feeling this way? Oh my gosh, I don't want to tell anybody. I don't want to tell my peers or my teachers because they might think I'm crazy. What's going on? And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we give them those tools to understand what they're feeling is normal. And give them, just educate them on different things they can do to cope with that, right? Help establish and re-establish a sense of safety, offer a variety of coping techniques. When Pam was talking about those stressors, those day-to-day stressors, right, and how we cope with them, and if we cope with them in a healthy or non-healthy way, when we're dealing with really extreme, severe stress, what happens is those normal coping mechanisms that we're using every day, those are failing. And so what we do, especially I think in adolescence this can happen, is we turn to things that are going to make us feel better, like substance use, right? We numb it out instead of feeling it and going through this journey through recovery. So that's really important we have to make sure that we offer our students different coping mechanisms. This is something you can try. If that doesn't work, then we're going to try this. We create a plan with them. Who are the people that you trust in your life? Who can you turn to if you're feeling like these coping mechanisms aren't working so we can come up with a new plan, right? Provide opportunities to talk in safe and non-judgmental spaces, and I want to double underline that because it's very different if a student says something to you that's scary or uncomfortable, and you say, you know, it sounds like that's really been very painful and difficult, but I think that we can work together and make it better. Versus the deer in the headlights look, where you're like, let me take you to the clinician's office. So we're just going to walk, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's very different. And one of the ways that you become prepared for this is to practice, right? And to educate yourself on these different techniques of how to respond when a student's in crisis. Because we always say there can only be one dysregulated person in the room and it can't be you, right? So that's really important. Maintain regular home and school routines. I think a lot of time people think, yeah, you know what, we're going to keep her home. We're going to keep her home for a few days. We're going to protect her. We're going to put her under a little wing. Okay, that's good. But also what I will say is maybe it's one day and then we let her go back to school, right? Or we let them go back to school, because that return to routine is very critical in that moment, because it helps them regain that sense of control where there is none. And so that can be really important in this moment as well. And I think parents or caregivers sometimes feel like, oh, that's insensitive. I don't want to push them out the door and make them go. But maybe it's, let's try to do a half day today and see how you feel. Let's let you go be with your friends and see if that feels better, right? With your teachers, with the people you trust. Monitor changes and respond appropriately, and then be patient. There's no correct timeline for healing. And I will say, I was recently out on a response, and I had a parent say to me, my daughter's been crying for 3 days straight. And I'm concerned. I think it's time to get a therapist. It's time to fully, let's engage the school-based mental health professional. Let's engage the community-based mental health professional. Let's do all this. And we had to take a moment. We had to unpack that, right? Because you have to ask yourself, if my best friend died, and I'm 13 years old, and this person that I care about and I love and I see every single day is no longer in my life, am I going to cry for 3 days straight? Probably. And what makes the 13-year-old any different from us? And so I think sometimes, too, as very caring, loving adults, what we do is we get really uncomfortable. We want to take the pain away, right? We want to shelter. We want to, take them under our little wing, but we can't do that. That's not possible. The only thing we can do is walk alongside them in their journey to recovery. And that can be really difficult, but it's something we have to do if we really want to support them. So the recovery process is tough. It's different for everybody. There's no timeline, right? And most children will recover within a few weeks, within a few months, depending on the incident, of course. But there are some children who are going to need some additional support. And in the next slide, we'll talk a bit more about severe psychological stress. But I do want to point out that we have to be cognizant of anniversaries, right? I will say, and I won't go into too much detail for confidentiality purposes, but we actually just recently responded to the January 26th helicopter crash. And so that was a really tough response for us because it's everywhere, right? Because these individuals who died were on the same helicopter as an international figure who everybody knows and loves and respects, right? Most people, a lot of people, whatever you want to say. But because it is so widely known, there was such difficulty in taking ourselves out of the equation, especially for the people who were connected to the young people who died, right? And so one of the things we had to really talk about is giving students permission to turn off their phones, or not even turn off, because that might not be okay. They might not do that. But maybe just taking a break. Maybe it's 10 minutes. And really recognizing with something so publicized and something so high profile, making sure you understand how it makes you feel when you're scrolling through your social media feed. Right? Because if you're scrolling through and you're seeing all these messages of hope and love for the person that you lost, that can make you feel unified. It can make you feel good, supported. It can be community. But if you're scrolling through there and what you're seeing is making you feel a visceral reaction, anger, they don't understand, they don't get it. Why are they talking more about this person than the person that I lost, right? Then we have to identify that and take a step back. What about the next time we celebrate this young person's birthday who's no longer with us? Are we considering that day? What about graduation? Right? There's a lot, and no matter what the incident is, it doesn't matter if it's high profile or it's we lost, it doesn't matter. What matters is we have to consider the nuances of these things and ensure that we're thinking inclusively about everybody and what those next things moving forward as we go through the recovery process. How do we do that for everybody? How do we ensure that we have a net and we catch every single person who needs our support? And that's a tough thing to do. But that's why collaboration, and that seems to be the theme of today's conference, right, is so vitally important. Now, that severe psychological stress I was talking about, and I'll go over this briefly. If you want to learn more, please come to my session tomorrow. But once we are seeing these signs and symptoms in our students for more than 2 weeks, if things are not fading or they're getting more severe, we absolutely need to seek out the next level of support. And I will just go briefly over a couple. So for preschoolers, it's going to likely be regression, so thumb sucking, bedwetting again, that very, very clingy young child. Elementary and middle school, younger middle school children, irritability, nightmares, school avoidance, poor concentration. And then in our older middle school children and adolescents, it looks more like sleeping and eating disturbances, agitation, increase in conflicts, and risky behaviors. And so obviously it varies child to child, but these are some things to consider. And so this, and I'll just read this. So it says, if we want to build strong children, we must be prepared to walk alongside them in their journey towards a new normal. A lot of times I hear adults say, well, next week everything will go back to normal. I heard some groans, and I appreciate them, because I caution against that language, because it's never going to be the same normal for them again, right? There's going to be a hole. There's going to be a gap. There's going to be new fears. This is going to be a different world for them that they're entering. And I think it's important for us to use the language new normal so that they're not trying to obtain something that's not obtainable. And we have to walk them through this. Again, I think too, a lot of times parents and well-meaning caregivers, they want to just scoop the children up and they want to take the pain away, and we can't do that. We have to learn how to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and we have to be patient, and we have to be well educated on how to best support our students through these events. Here are some different resources. If you can take a picture, or I can send this to you if you would like this. But these are some different resources I think are really helpful, especially in the crisis world. So you have things like the Orange County Crisis Prevention Hotline. We have a text line. So I think that's really important for our youth, because we know they're not making calls, right? That's just not what they do. So that's really important to have. Orange County Behavioral Health Referrals, right? OC Links 211. The NAMI OC Warm Line is really important to know for our families who are supporting students who are experiencing trauma. Because as much as it is difficult for that student to navigate that, how difficult is it for our families to navigate helping their student through that, right? And so this is definitely a great means of support for our family members who are supporting people who have experienced trauma. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline, the Trevor Lifeline for LGBTQ+, and then Crisis Assessment Team, the CAT team. So if there's ever an emergency, right, it's very critical and we need an assessment immediately, somebody who might harm themselves or others, this is the line to call. And last but not least, it is so critical to take care of ourselves. So we talk about the oxygen mask, right? Got to put it on first. And I say that, and I want to be transparent, and I don't always do that effectively, right? Because we are all very busy. We're all trying to do really great work, and I commend that, and I appreciate that. But if we don't make time for ourselves, if we don't give ourselves the same grace that we would give people we're supporting, we're going to run out of steam. And so I think we have to ensure that we make time for ourselves, so that we can give the best of us rather than what's left of us. Thank you so much.
Is it?
Did it work? There we go. Yeah. Pam and Stephanie are two 13 presenters tomorrow at Orange County Department of Education. So I just wanted to point that out, because when Dr. Morgan said we want to start energy, we need to look at it as just slapping our logo on the program.
Our staff at the Orange County Department of Ed are so committed to supporting this work that we have created custom workshops for you. So I really hope that you do come tomorrow. You go to their workshops and our other colleagues. You'll hear from more in the plenary this afternoon and tomorrow morning as well. So let's move right into questions. Are you ready? Okay. I'm going to refresh this. And looks like we've got 2 questions. So if you haven't yet asked one and you want to, of either Pam or Stephanie, please go ahead and contribute to Slido. Again, that's on the back side of your program there. So, question, is the obesity rate increase in our nation associated to adverse childhood experiences? Pam?
But that's a very insightful question. Whoever asked that, you're really thinking. There's certainly never been a study to prove that. Obesity is a multifactorial, has multifactorial causes, obviously. However, if you look at the study with Dr. Folletti and Kaiser, clearly obesity is one of our coping mechanisms for stress. And frankly, probably most of us in this room can identify, right? You reach for the chips or your high carb foods or your pizzas when we're feeling, well, sometimes feeling low and even sometimes when we're happy. So my guess would be it certainly has contributed, the stress that we are feeling, the trauma that we have suffered in our lives, I think that has increased in society lately, which consequently increases our poor coping mechanisms, of which overeating is one. I've never been to an Overeating Anonymous meeting. It would be interesting to go and see how those people describe their motivations. But again, a very good point, and I would bet, even though there's not been studies, that yes, that is probably one of the causes, one of the many, but certainly a fairly substantial cause of reactions to stress.
Thank you. I think this one's for Stephanie. My 6-year-old grandkid in kindergarten has an active shooter drill every week and is one of the leaders to make sure everyone hides. Can this cause long-term trauma?
So your 6-year-old grandson is actually the leader of an active shooter drill that's happening weekly?
Weekly.
I would advise against that. I don't know. I have the privilege to also work on our threat assessment team with Christine Laley at the Orange County Department of Ed. And so what we do is we actually only train our staff. That's the model that we have used because we don't want to traumatize our youth, right? With having to lead, especially a 6-year-old that's very young. I don't necessarily know, right? We can't say if it is going to cause long-term trauma or stress or anything of that nature, but what I would advise you to do is to speak with the school personnel and maybe ask why that's their model, and maybe explore that a little bit. And if you're uncomfortable with your grandson being the leader of that, I would absolutely tell them that they no longer should be doing that. There are a lot of different models and there's a lot of different reasons why people do things the way that they do. But if you would like to come talk to me, if you feel comfortable with doing that, I would love to give you some different resources to guide you or guide that conversation with your school personnel about some different, maybe trauma-informed ways that your students can be prepared for active shooter, but maybe not in that way.
And Pam has a comment as well.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we cope with trauma, whether it's an acute trauma, which means like a car accident or something that's happened all of a sudden, or even chronic, you remove children or people from the scene. You do not keep exposing them. So for example, when we had 911, many years ago, many of you will remember they showed it on a loop practically, right? It doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help children to keep being re-exposed and re-exposed and re-exposed. The increase in exposure will increase the reaction naturally. So in this case, first of all, weekly, I'm not going to comment on district's choice of strategy, but, that's exposing children every week to a fairly frightening, out of their control situation. I can't imagine it's beneficial for their mental health and well-being, but basically just remember that we want to minimize exposure, and it doesn't mean hide, and it doesn't mean lie to kids. It means tell them in a direct, straightforward manner what's happening, and then move on. Don't belabor it.
This next question often comes up when we talk about adverse childhood experiences. How can people who are now adults heal from their harmful childhood experiences?
That's really big. And thank you for whoever asked that question, because you can heal. So what I talk about a lot is brain development that has gone a little bit awry. There are instances and personality developments that are very difficult to work with. But if you're motivated and you understand what's happening with you, you can change the course of this. What we all learn in therapy, and frankly, all of us can benefit from some of this, we learn to reframe how we react to things. So oftentimes trauma, if you suffered trauma as a child, you may experience things like being hypervigilant, worried all of the time. You may be depressed. You may not want to engage with people. You may not trust. All of these are issues that when you work with a qualified therapist that you work well with, therapists have personalities, we have personalities, you have to find one that works with you. You learn to change your reactions, and that's how you start to heal. You confront the trauma and you talk about it. You don't have to spill your guts to everybody about it, but you really recognize what happened to you, and more importantly, what it's doing in your life now and how can you make that better. It is not a lost cause if you have suffered trauma as a child. There is always hope for change and repair, and if you work hard at it and you're dedicated to do it, your life can improve and will improve.
Thank you. The most recent 2019 ACE study now lists divorce as an adverse childhood experience. It didn't in the 1998 ACE study. What would you tell an abused wife?
Well, an abused wife, there's trauma, first of all, for her, and of course for the child who grew up in that family. It's just what we just talked about. You have suffered a trauma, and oftentimes in abused wives, are abused spouses, because it does happen to men too. They become withdrawn, they become afraid, they become very subject to having very poor self-images because they believe what they've been told. Again, you've got to get in to get some qualified therapy. If you don't have insurance, there are many places that you can go for sliding scale, and that means if you don't have the money, they won't take any. But you've got to get some qualified therapy. If you have had situations like that and you are suffering in your life, none of us get through this life alone. And if you have had major traumas and are experiencing major effects from that trauma, you need some strong help. So please don't hesitate to reach out and get help. It is out there. We can help you find it. 211 Orange County can help you find it. But you need it. It's worth it because you've got a beautiful life to live.
Thank you, Pam. Stephanie, sometimes the students who are being supported share information and/or stories that trigger past trauma to the adult. How should the adult best respond?
I appreciate that question. I think so at least with our crisis teams, what we tell them is if you have had something happen to you, or if you have a child within the same age range and that's the age of the child that is deceased, right? We ask you to be really self-reflective and maybe not respond in those moments, or tell your supervisor, hey, I don't think that this is appropriate for me to be on because I have some past traumas and so on and so forth. Now, if you're in the moment with a student and they say something and it triggers something in you, I guess it depends on how severe that trigger is for you, but I would ask you to stay calm, acknowledge, obviously, the student and what they're saying to you, ensure that they feel heard, and then ensure them that you're going to work with them to get them the correct support, right? So that might not be you. Also, before I ever talk to a student, and especially if it's in a more formalized way, I always say, I want to work through this with you, but if I find that I'm not the appropriate person to do that, if I think somebody else can do it better than me, then I'm going to make sure that I get you to that person. How does that sound? And they're usually comfortable with that. And I think that's a good way to put in a tagline beforehand in case that moment does come and then you need to make that transition. And I would say make sure you're really transparent and communicative with your supervisors and different teams so that you have a system where people can share in that moment if need be.
Thank you. When family ties are strong, does the threat of poverty affect a child in any way remotely similar to an adverse childhood experience?
Yeah, I get that question sometimes, and sometimes it creates a bit of defensiveness when I say poverty can increase childhood trauma and ACEs. Certainly it is not a given that it does. There are very strong families and whose children have come out beautifully and had very rich childhoods in ways that aren't money, but family experiences, exposures to life, support, etc. We do know that poverty tends to increase ACEs because of what often, but not always, accompanies poverty. Like I mentioned to you, malnutrition, chaos in the family. You know, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Families oftentimes are struggling because they're chaotic. There's a lot of noise in poverty, in families of poverty. It's a very interesting culture. A lot goes on that can cause trauma, but absolutely not is it a straight, definitive equation. If you're poor, you're going to have ACEs and childhood trauma, and your brain is not going to function the same way or grow the same way. No, it's just that there are a lot of factors that exist that may contribute to childhood trauma.
Okay, and I think we have time for one or two. We have 2 questions left, but I just want to do a time check. We're okay for 2 more? Okay. How do you help, this is a big, broad question. How do you help a child who is being sexually abused by a parent?
Report it.
Immediately.
Yes, report it. You report it, and you intervene, and you get that child appropriate help. Often, now let me tell you something about reporting. I don't know how well versed all of you are in this as school nurses. We are very trained and know what's going on. Most of you may be mandated reporters if you work in an educational setting. When a child comes to you and talks to you about this, and you are the person who needs to report, because legally, if you're a mandated reporter, if the child told you, you need to report. You can't say, hey, would you report it? Whatever. Do not question that child further. You let the professionals handle that, because you may create more trauma in that child, and on a pragmatic consideration, you may blow that trial. If you lead that child in a direction that you shouldn't have, and that can be figured out, you let professionals who are well versed in how to do this do it, but you report it immediately. And then we make sure that child is taken care of. We're working on, hopefully we can develop some kind of program that schools will be notified of children, not necessarily what has happened to that child, but just that child might need some extra care. And you can do that in your own environment. You can say, hey, I've heard that, Sheila's been having a tough time lately. Maybe we can give her a little extra care. You don't always need to know the reason why, the people in that child's life. You just need to know that child needs some support. Because remember, it's the buffering of a supportive relationship that reduces the trauma after effects in a child's life. So just because a child has been sexually abused, we can help. That child can make it through, but not without help. And report, and make sure that's followed up.
Final question. Did you want to say anything about that, Stephanie?
Agreed.
Okay. Final question. What are some best practices you've observed in the prevention of trafficking in children?
I would think you've had speakers, or will have speakers, that are much better versed in trafficking. Simply all we know, is all of that we try to do in every situation. For example, the sexually abused child or the human trafficked, the youth or the young girl that we feel might be being human trafficked, we report our concerns to the appropriate authorities. Again, I wouldn't ask too many questions, because we want the process to go smoothly and appropriately. But give that child help. Pay attention to that child, that youth, whether it be a male or female, because again, males are trafficked as well. Just provide support for that child, as any child in crisis. Each type of trauma may take a certain kind of intervention, and human sex trafficking, a child or a youth who's been sex trafficked, will certainly need a different kind of care than somebody who maybe's been neglected. They all need support, but we need to get them the appropriate kind of care for what they need, and that's why reporting. And let me tell you something about reporting. People are often hesitant to report child abuse, what we might think is child abuse. You are doing that family a service, because that family is not probably going to have the child taken away occasionally, or not having someone leave the home. Occasionally that happens. That family is in crisis and needs some help and some support. So when you are reporting, you are not punitively doing this. You are doing this in the manner of help and charity and benefit. Human trafficking, of course, that's a far different thing. Again, report immediately and connect them, because we know in our legal system, we have whole systems set up to help those victims.
And I will just briefly say, I think more broadly, for prevention, it's about relationships. And so Dr. Meharez said it this morning, OCDE did this campaign around Know My Name, Face, and Story, right? And so if we have every child have some kind of mentor, especially children who are more vulnerable, right? Who have low social support or don't have as many resources. They need stronger relationships. And the more we know our students and have those relationships and they have mentors, we're going to see those signs earlier and we're going to be able to intervene earlier. And so I think that that is key in the prevention of most things, but especially this as well.
Please help me thank Pamela Kahn and Stephanie Lasco. I'm